if just getting it done isn't good enough. If you see each obstacle as an opportunity. If you're always looking for a smarter way. You've come to the right place. We are Thornton Tomasetti. Every day, we apply engineering principles to solve the world's challenges, starting with yours. Whatever issue you face, we have your solution. We get to the heart of every problem, digging deep to understand its intricacies and nuances, so we can help you achieve your goals, together. For us, no task is too trivial and no aspiration too lofty. Here, we consider out-of-the-box methods, no matter what we're working on. Here, we share knowledge to create solutions that are greater than the sum of their parts. And here, the way it's been done before never limits us, when doing things differently right now means doing them better in the future. Because like you, we're leaders who strive to stay one step ahead in all our work. And we know that success isn't just about making your mark today, it's also about making an impact tomorrow. So when others say no, we say, here's how.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to an amazing Ascend 2021 webinar today. We are really excited to have you. This is, I will be honest, a part of our industry that I personally don't know much about. And so when our Ascend committee decided to host an event like this, I, like many people, was a little confused, and that's okay. And then in learning a little bit more about it, I realized just how critical this part of our industry is. And I think the excitement of the speakers we have today, as well as the fact that we've got several hundred people watching, is a testament to the importance of the future of this part of our industry. So let me start by saying thank you to our sponsors today, our groundbreaker sponsor, Thornton Tomasetti, and that was a great video, by the way. The Trendsetters, National Grid and STV Group, and our Pioneer sponsor, Autodesk. The Ascend webinar series, based on our 2019 Ascend conference, looks at innovation and technology in the building industry, and really where do we go next and what's the future for us. This program is a collaboration with the Building Congress's Young Professional Committee, which I started with Marilisa and one of our speakers today, Andrew, what was that, about 4 years ago? And we were very excited about it. And we've got a great steering committee. And the young professionals who, when recently asked what topics they would like to see discussed, they said timber. So we said, okay. And it's really exciting. So these are experts in this field. It promises to be an informative discussion on what the future of mass timber looks like in New York. Let me introduce and welcome our panelists. Doug Hocking, Principal at KPF. Kevin Morin, Principal, Code Consultants, Inc. Christopher Peltier, Partner at Cerami. John Paranto, Senior Principal at Thornton Tomasetti. And Michelle Roloffs, Associate Structural at Arup. And of course, our co-moderators today, Delia Ridgey, Project Engineer at HNTB, and she is currently co-chair of the Young Professionals Committee, and my good friend Andrew Werner, Senior Associate Principal, KPF, former co-chair of the Young Professional, and currently a member of the steering committee. And really, thank you all for doing this. I'm excited to hear about this issue, and I'm going to turn it over to Delia and Andrew. Have a great day.
Thank you, Carlo, and thank you, everybody. So Delia and I are really pleased to be able to host this with you all. And this discussion on mass timber, I think, actually started at a committee meeting for Council of Innovation on Best Practices that we were sitting in the quaint times of, let's say, January 2020, when we brought up this idea for mass timber. And obviously the world changed a little bit since that meeting, but mass timber has continued to be absolutely on the forefront of discussion in all places since then. So I'm really happy that we have finally gotten a chance to all sit down like this and have this discussion. So very excited at what, the topics that we're going to bring up here.
Yes, Andrew, thanks. And then when we were also discussing in Young Professionals Committee about the topics we wanted to talk about in the future and subjects for future programs, mass timber was a top choice of the entire committee. We knew we had to get involved in this panel. It's exciting to be involved in the conversation at a time when mass timber has created such enthusiasm for the future of building materials. And for me, it's the combination of structural performance, aesthetics, and the opportunity that this material offers.
So with that, why don't we kick it off? I think, Delia, you have the first topics. I mean, I think the goal here is we're going to try, as best we can with the webinar format to try and make this a fluid discussion for everybody, and then leave some time for Q&A from everybody watching at the end. But obviously, we encourage all the panelists to kind of jump in as things arise, and we will kind of take the conversation where it goes.
Yes. So question number one, what defines a mass timber project? Doug, do you think you could give us an overview?
Sure, and thanks for inviting me. So I think the first thing with mass timber is to understand that it's been around for a very, very long time. We think of it as being new because we're primarily thinking of cross-laminated timber, but it's been a building system that's been around for hundreds of years. And in the most simplest way to think about it, you can think about it as an extension of the history of framing options that are given to wood construction, from light wood framing to post and beam, now to mass timber. But what mass timber, the way that we think about it now with CLT and glulam, offers us is something really truly unique. And because of how it's designed, it offers two things that are unique. One is this ability to withstand seismic forces because it works in two directions. And because of how it's engineered, it provides its own fireproofing. So there's a zone that's for structural and then a zone for fireproofing. And also more captivating, I think, to a lot of us is that it's incredibly sustainable if it's done right in terms of how the wood is forested and how the wood is treated in terms of brought to the site. And so that paired with the just natural beauty of wood, I think, creates this really captivating environment. One of the confusing points about mass timber is that it's really just also a building system too. It doesn't mean that the whole building has to be wood, although it could be in some applications, but it also could be seen as a material that's used in conjunction with steel and concrete to create something that's even more dynamic.
Michelle, is there anything maybe that you want to, from an engineering standpoint, that you may want to add to that?
Sure. Yeah, I think one thing I'd like to point out are a few common misconceptions about mass timber. So one, I think Doug touched on this, but when we talk about mass timber, it's not just cross-laminated timber, but there's a wide variety of materials available to us. There's glulam, nail laminated timber, dowel laminated timber, mass plywood panels, LVL. So kind of remembering the suite of products that we have available to us is kind of kit of parts along with traditional building materials. Another is to just keep in mind that light frame construction, where a lot of people are familiar, single family housing is quite different than mass timber in the way it performs under fire and even structurally. And while we're talking about mass timber, we're not really talking about traditional kind of stick frame single family housing construction.
I think that's a really good point of understanding. And to that engineering side, I think maybe Kevin and John, do you have a little bit of information to help explain how mass timber is engineered and specifically how this deals with fire resistance and why this is a really efficient method of construction?
Yeah, so I'll jump in real quick here. So mass timber, by definition, is timber of a certain dimensional size criteria. And based on the size of the lumber, it actually provides inherent fire resistance. So it does burn, of course, because it is wood, but it also chars, and that char layer actually provides the fire resistance rating. So a common misconception is that mass timber provides no fire resistance rating. In fact, the codes recognize it as equivalent to 1 hour rated from a fire perspective.
Yeah, and to kind of add a little bit onto it where we are in the industry, we're getting to a pivotal time where a lot of the data is now available for some of the products, not let alone the CLT, But the glulam members themselves, which we traditionally have designed the char layer thicknesses for fire protection just through empirical equations in the code, we now have data that takes our fire ratings all the way up to 3 hours for glulam members that will be publicly available very soon, which really opens the door to providing the performance requirements for Type 1A construction out of mass timber. So as far as the engineering goes with the fire resistance, we're to a point now where a lot of data is available.
Yeah, and just to further that, John, it's all the traditional tests still, right? It's ASTM E119, it's the standard time temperature curve that's been around for 100 years. So we're really just advancing mass timber in a way that gives us a better fire resistant rating.
Yeah, and maybe to add one more fact that's great to add on to that is the first 3-hour column fire tests were completed in actually 2020 at the American Forest Products Laboratory for multiple species of wood through a really good collaboration through many different professional organizations, as well as design professional companies that are doing mass timber. And that data in itself will be confirmatory to what we used currently for those equations, which is wonderful news too.
Excellent. So we're all aware of the life cycle of timber and its carbon reducing properties when harvested sustainably. Do you think you could tell us a little bit about the benefits of using mass timber and how mass timber building materials can reduce the carbon footprint of a structure? Somebody want to kick us off with that?
So I guess go ahead.
Yeah, I can jump in. I guess starting with the sustainability aspect, just because it is so important, is we have for those that maybe aren't aware, as trees grow, they take CO2 and convert that to oxygen, which sequesters the carbon in its life cycle. And so as you're basically sequestering carbon in this building material. You use energy, obviously, when you cut down a tree, mill it, fabricate it into a building panel, transport it to site and construct it, but you are often still left in a kind of carbon negative environment, which is great when you're really looking at your overall carbon footprint of a building. But a few kind of important, really key items to make sure that you're making sustainable choices is that, as Delia just mentioned, that you are taking this timber from a sustainably managed forest. If you're not doing that, you're really not sequestering any carbon, and you're actually just contributing to the worsening of greenhouse gas effects in the country. So that's a really, really key point. And there's a lot of certifications out there that you can specify to make sure that that's the type of material that you're specifying. There's also can be significant carbon when you're transporting, so making sure that you're making the best choice that you can for your project in terms of transportation. And then lastly, we don't often have a lot of say in this, but end of life of building is very important. So if you incinerate at the end of life, you're really just releasing that carbon back into the environment. So something really key, especially if you're involved in a project where you're maybe adaptively reusing an existing building and you have some decision over how you treat the timber at the end of life.
I think one thing to piggyback on what Michelle's talking about too is some of the studies that we've been doing for projects in the adaptive reuse category. You find interesting benefits of mass timber also. It's inherently a lighter structural system. So when you're looking at sort of adding or subtracting from a building and you don't want to impact footings or foundations, there are advantages to that in terms of what you could do by sort of taking advantage of the fact that it's a fairly lightweight system. The other part to it too, which I think is just inherently sort of just really interesting, is the speed of construction potentially. In terms of it is a simple system, there's lots of screw guns and things like that. And compared to what you can do, you have one material and one set of construction workers that potentially gives you an advantage in terms of construction schedule and timing.
Yeah, and adding on to what Doug just said, there's also so much prefabrication capability, and most mass timber is fabricated in a place with CNC milling, so you can get a lot of your openings, routing for electrical, for services done, so you don't have to do that in field, and it really speeds up your time on site. And that's important on all construction sites, but also particularly in an adaptive reuse case where you're maybe trying to keep the building occupied or disrupted for a least amount of time.
So I think that actually is a really good segue into one of the other major topics here. And someone actually just asked on the Q&A that said, is this approved by the FDNY? Which I think we're getting to in a second. That's kind of the basis of my next question, which is, we've seen this really gaining a lot of popularity in Europe and on the West Coast of the US, where I know a lot of you have been doing work. So can you talk a little bit about that advancement, especially West Coast in Europe, and then maybe why we aren't necessarily seeing that type of adoption, let's say East Coast or even New York City specific? Maybe
I can speak to the East Coast, West Coast difference, and I think there's a few things. So we've seen the expansion of mass timber in a lot of areas where there was already a strong culture of forestry and the use of timber in smaller scale buildings. So that's, when you look at Austria and Germany and Italy or the Pacific Northwest, there are regions that had a kind of smaller scale timber industry much before the kind of current resurgence. There's also been a lot of support in many of these areas from the government to allow larger and larger buildings. So for example, in British Columbia, there was a policy for all public buildings that they would consider timber as one of the possible material choices on any project if it was publicly funded, which helped spur that area. Oregon and Washington both had really strong support from their governors to help push through some of the early provisions that I'm sure we'll get to in this conversation that are now coming out in IBC 2021. And so we've had areas that have both a history and a kind of strong support from the government. On the East Coast, we are behind a little bit in both respects. So there's not as much just small scale timber construction that you see in the tri-state area. And there is also some hesitation from building authorities, FDNY, to move quickly on these newer provisions when there maybe isn't as much familiarity with the material here. So I think, but to the specific question from the panelists, there is type 4 construction that's currently in the code that is, you can build as of right in the city. There's just limitations for height and area and the materials that can be used in New York City.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I mean, it even dates back to the 1968 code and 1938 building codes. Anyone participating today is familiar with Empire Stores. That was just renovated and opened as a market, and that is all heavy timber construction. That's filed as heavy timber. To Michelle's point, there is some hesitation to go very tall with timber in New York City. The 2021 IBC does let you go up to 18 stories for certain occupancies now, but that is not yet adopted in New York City and probably won't be for some time. New York City is currently in the revision process today to adopt the 2015 IBC. And when that is adopted, as amended by New York City, of course, that will specifically address things like CLT for the first time. And FDNY was part of that committee. That is a consensus committee and a consensus committee process. So yes, FDNY is very aware of heavy timber and in the direction it's moving.
I think there's also a distinction between where the projects are actually getting built and just the general enthusiasm for mass timber. So 2 of our projects that are mass timber are in Texas. And every time we do a competition, we show an option where we could do some component of it in wood. And every developer in every state is really interested and captivated by what the potential is. They might be a little scared to be the first one on the block to do it. But I think acknowledging that there's a lot of interest in all the states to look at this as a building system. And as the code catches up, as Kevin mentioned, you're going to find that this is something that's going to saturate a much larger market than just the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, and I think to add on to that, that leads to, I think, a really important point in the industry. Now, what we've seen in our project here in Milwaukee, which is the Ascent project, not Ascend, but Ascent. It's right now targeting to be the tallest mass timber building in the world. It really found that the supply chain itself is still not of scale to really service the entire demand across the country now that's building. I think Michelle said it best that, there's been incentive on the West Coast and regions where that forest, let's just say product was incentivized in certain areas. And I think the desire to kind of bring that across the country has been slowly, I would say, migrating towards flyover country in the Midwest And I think it's making its way, east. We're seeing a lot of activity in areas even like upstate New York and other areas on the East Coast where this product is being looked at pretty strongly. But the biggest challenge I think the industry has is with respect to the actual supply chain. There's not much capacity in North America compared to Europe or even that in Australia. So I think as that market matures, I think that will help proliferate this type of building from an economic standpoint.
Great. Yeah, that was good discussion on that. So we had a question in the Q&A section about, can you explain the concept of sustainably grown forest, which I think we touched on a little bit, but if you, John or Michelle, could expand a little bit on, does this mean we create the acres of land designated to grow and harvested for lumber? Are there sort of an accreditation for a sustainable forest? And do we have those in the United States yet?
I can maybe add just one commentary to that. I think we have lots of forests. I think the management of the forest, production is going to be key. But the bottleneck right now is in the production. Actually creating the products like the glulam and the CLT. So I know there's lots of pushes in certain areas down south with some of the larger developments being proposed in mass timber for companies like Walmart, which is really going to change the supply chain. And companies like Katerra building their own production facilities. But the bottleneck really isn't in the timber itself, it's in the production of the product.
Yeah, and to speak just to the sustainably managed forest, I'm not a forestry expert, but there are certifications out there that you can look to now. So the most common one in the US is FSC, which is Forest Stewardship Council. There is also Sustainable Forestry Initiative, SFI, and Program for the Endorsement of Forest Certification. So there's a few certifications out there that you can look to. But the overall process is that the forests are managed in such a way that you are not clear cutting, old growth tree without, the appropriate amount of regrowth that's timed such that you're able to really sequester carbon and keep a healthy forest. So there are a lot of studies out there around FSC if you're interested in learning more.
I think too, to add to that, it's important to understand that mass timber is made by small cubic dimensions of wood as opposed to really large pieces of wood. So it can actually be grown in trees that are younger. And so the idea is that the tree, as it sort of grows and is juvenile, it's actually capturing more carbon. And at a certain point, as it gets older, it's capturing less. So you're actually maximizing the carbon sequestration from the tree process by having this ability to take small pieces of wood to make large format blanks in the CLT.
But one of the other good follow-up question from the Q&A that actually was on our list of things that we really wanted to discuss, but acoustical performance of a system like this. Chris, can you talk a little bit about how this is different than a normal structural system and how this affects, especially your work as an acoustical engineer, what this means for the occupants of buildings?
Yeah, it definitely adds an interesting layer for us. And a lot of our projects, we're seeing that we have to bring in traditional construction materials as well to offset the lighter structure and the lighter mass of the timber. And so the other part of it is a lot of our projects we're seeing are exposed structure because the wood is nice to look at. It's a beautiful structure. And so we're seeing less and less ceilings in those types of projects. So it's a little bit of an added thing for us to address. And so it affects both the airborne noise transfer from tenant space to tenant space or residence to residence, as well as the impact from people walking around in footfall. And then there's a third aspect that we're looking at that people haven't quite done as much research on, but that's the vibration impact and occupant comfort from walking through the space or mechanical equipment in the space and actually exciting the structure and creating vibration. And so a lot of that is, like I said, addressed through adding traditional construction materials on top of the timber slab and playing with different components and finding the right balance between the thickness of each of those components. Do we do a 7-inch CLT or do we go a little bit thinner and add different things on top? Playing around with damping in rubber materials and concrete on top of it or different material combinations and really honing that in to find the right amount of weight and mass and achieving all the code and expectations. So much like concrete or steel structures, where a lot of projects are seeing underlayments for acoustics because we have a lot of hard surface floors, and that's how we're addressing a lot of the impact isolation.
Thank you, Chris. So there's been a few questions in the Q&A, and we kind of wanted to go back a little bit and touch on specific code considerations in New York. And Kevin, you and John touched on performance during burn tests, but what are some of the other specific code considerations, and how do we plan for a future using mass timber products when there isn't even products recognized by the New York City code at this time?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about it before, but the code that's being evaluated for adoption in New York City right now is based on the 2015 IBC. That does, for the first time now, recognize CLT, and that will be adopted in New York City. Until New York City adopts the 2021 IBC, we're not going to have super tall structures made of timber. Part of the problem is politics as well. I saw in the Q&A, somebody did ask about other trades. Obviously, if we're doing timber buildings, we're taking away work from the steel workers, iron workers, and other trades. So that is, of course, for the unions here in New York City, a big consideration as well. If anybody's interested, there's a really good summary document that the ICC has put out about all of the code changes that went into the 2021 IBC, specifically for mass timber and heavy timber structures. So if anyone's really interested, it's a great summary document. It gives you all the history as well for how these code changes came about.
How, Kevin, you touched on it a little bit, but the fact, and this is sort of a wider question really for everybody, but, the fact that a mass timber building is not made of just mass timber. Chris hit on it pretty well with the acoustical considerations, but a lot of these are hybrid systems. So, what becomes of those other trades, and how do you guys in the industry see the role of other construction materials working with mass timber in the long run to become a cohesive whole?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, every building material has its kind of appropriate place, in terms of scale and size. And it's not like mass timber is going to sort of replace concrete and steel in a place like New York City anytime, that we can foresee. But it could be a viable construction material for a certain size of building or a certain, adaptive reuse condition. So it's always going to be part of a mix. It's never going to sort of to scale replace entire sectors. And that's just true. And it's like, so you'll find that mass timber, that we all sort of envision at the 85 feet and below, where it's all exposed wood, has a certain spot. And you can imagine taller structures having a certain spot too, maybe for residential. But once you start getting even taller, you're going to find that these hybrid systems that kind of come in, whether CLT is involved in them or not, might be viable, but you'll have this kind of graduated scale of material and use wherever you use it. So it's not like it's going to come in and change entire industries, in terms of the building systems, but it's one of those things where it's a really nice, healthy, sustainable tool in your belt to have, depending on what option you want to build with.
Yeah, and maybe to add a little bit to that too, it kind of harkens back to when some of the more modern high-rise construction systems were developed back in the 70s and 80s. You can envision back the concrete core and steel frame office building that was really kind of a modern step forward in construction, mixing the trades. That was always something that was kind of a natural progression of design. And similarly to what Doug just mentioned, it's finding a material that makes sense for what you're trying. I don't think wood will replace steel or concrete either. I think that it will have its place in the market. I think its performance requirements, will be up to par, but there are limitations to certain materials. Wood's a lot softer. So even just from a practicality standpoint, the size and dimensionality of the pieces, becomes a limiting factor depending on how high you want to go. But I do think that these composite buildings, even the Ascent project in Milwaukee, has concrete cores. It's really a composite mass timber building. I think that's the trend you're going to see. Similar to even steel and concrete being intermixed for the first composite slabs that were done in steel beam framing. So I think it'll find its place, and I think it will be looked at more as hybrid systems than specifically just timber.
Excellent, thank you. So Michelle, we were talking about code requirements and restrictions and adoption, and there seems to be some reservations for mass timber in New York City at the moment. So what type of projects, John was touching about that mass timber has its place. So where are we seeing the place? What is the place that timber takes the the market in New York City?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of excitement around tall buildings, and I think that is an exciting place. But in order to really get there in New York City or in the East Coast at all, I think there's a lot of buildings that we can build right now, as of right, 6 stories or less, and in the tri-state, where we may even get our 2021 IBC provisions and be able to live within the new provisions that allow you to go up to 12 or 18 stories. So I think trying to work within the current code in the tri-state area will really allow us to build up the industry, build up the familiarity, both by building officials and the construction industry, so that we can get to those larger projects that I think are very exciting. And I do think, Doug mentioned this earlier, but a really important place where I think the industry should be looking is at adaptive reuse, both just generally, and that's a really important aspect of building in order to just generally keep our carbon footprint down, and it's a sustainable way to build, but also it's an appropriate place for timber. It's lightweight, you can add additional stories while potentially not needing to upgrade your foundations, and it can help in tight footprints where you have this fast construction time.
Yeah, and I'll just add that in New York City, so New York City has committed to a 3-year revision cycle to look at and evaluate the new IBCs for adoption. However, as most things in New York, they're on more of a 6-year revision cycle. There was a 2008 code that was based on the 03 IBC, there was a 2014 code, and now we're gonna have a 2021 code coming out soon. So the next adoption cycle probably won't be for another 3, 4, 5 years. And that would probably be the next opportunity for some of these new provisions that enter the market in New York City for the 5 boroughs.
So you see this in general for New York as a 5 years and out type adoption, or let's call it, larger adoption and scale up of this type of material in the city.
For anything over that 6 stories or 85 feet in height, that's right.
And what about supply chain aspects on the East Coast here, and how the supply chain is potentially affected by the code adoptions?
Well, right now in the East Coast, there's a few suppliers that supply most of the timber here. So Nordic up in Quebec supplies a lot in the East Coast. And we do have the opportunity to have timber shipped from Europe. It's not necessarily, it occasionally can be the most cost-effective solution, but obviously we would like to increase the supply chain here on the East Coast. It's a little bit of a chicken or the egg situation, though, where there needs to be the demand for someone to invest in a new factory, and we haven't really seen how that's going to play out yet on the East Coast. And I guess one thing to add, Kevin, I'm sure can speak more to this, that I highly encourage the trying to kind of live within the code restrictions. There are paths to try to get approval, but they are sometimes successful. I don't know if Kevin, you want to speak a bit to that.
Yeah, so performance-based design has been around for a long time. It's very widely accepted overseas in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, etc. New York City doesn't look quite as commonly upon performance-based design. And so any sort of a variance from the code, actually you have to go through that process with both DOB and FDNY. New York City has just historically been a lot more conservative than other jurisdictions. But yeah, there's always a variance path. John, I think your project, right, was all done through performance-based design.
Yeah, so the project in Milwaukee is actually under the IBC 2015, and its compliance to IBC does come through performance-based fire principles through the actual fire testing of the mass timber elements. I think as the next generations of IBC codes come out, you will start to see more of a pre-qualified kit of parts or kit of systems that will become codified. And it's actually interesting at this point in time, the data and everything is there in order to be IBC compliant. But if you are under the framework of IBC, even 2021, you're still going to be going through likely the performance-based design approaches to get variances on exposure of the mass timber. The approach that was done even in the IBC 2021 is a bit conservative still. It really did not address the fire performance requirements for exposed timber at height, which actually there it just never had a chance to get into that cycle. So I think in the next generations, we're slowly getting there, but you will still need to do variances through the IBC 2015 framework if you're going to go above the height restrictions for type 4.
Interesting. So there was a question in the Q&A section about the resins. So the question is, and maybe Doug, you can touch on this for us. Can you discuss the resins and adhesives that are used to make the CLTs? Do they have VOC issues? And how much of the manufacturing process reduces the carbon sequestration?
It's a great question. Like it's out of my league, but in terms of the plants that are doing the CLT at this point, it's both the sort of VOCs and the resins being used that are concerned, but also the fire spread and the issues about fire. So both of those, I think if you've got the plant that's doing everything right, sustainably farmed wood with the right glues that are coming into it that solve also in terms of how fire works, that should be considered when you're doing your specifications and notifying which type of wood you need, because obviously you don't want to have the wood be green, but the resins be toxic.
And the only thing I'd add to that is that the 2021 IBC, really recognizes CLT and the fire tests associated with CLT and all the tests that show that it does not delaminate in fires. And that went a long way to the 2021 code changes that now allow you to go taller with mass timber. The one misconception is, of course, when you get into those taller buildings, as John mentioned, it's usually encased. Timber has to be encased in gypsum or some other material. It's not just exposed mass timber 18 stories in height.
I think one of the things, sorry, go ahead, John.
No, I was just going to say that PRG 320 really took a great leap forward for the glue, for the delamination aspects, but I think everyone is going to be, particularly stakeholders at, the fire department as well as, the city building officials, that in a fire, the smoke aspects to mass timber and exposed mass timber are a critical component of discussion that has to be had. A lot of these buildings meet their fire ratings without a doubt through testing, but the aspect of the structure being part of the fuel and understanding what the smoke is critical to understanding the health and safety for the firefighters that have to actually, go into these events in an extreme circumstance.
And this might be a little bit of a retread, but when you look at what mass timber is kind of ideally suited for, if you have an office building and you're using mass timber throughout it, what you're going to find is that the glulam beam is obviously less efficient in terms of structure than a steel beam. And so the depth of that becomes a real challenge in terms of floor to floor heights. So you tend to need more columns, which isn't necessarily ideal for an office. But when you look at things that need cells, like for CLT, residential comes to mind, and residential seems like an obvious sort of application for CLT because you're using the CLT for both the wall and the floor system. And so what we're seeing a lot in our London office is that in Europe, CLT is a primary construction method for low-scale residential, both on the affordable side and on the market side. And when you look at the States and you look at 5/1 construction with balloon framing, it's easy to imagine CLT actually replacing the balloon framing in 5/1 construction, which exists in a lot of these TOD cities. So I think there's kind of a natural spot, both in height and in program, for this material, I think, to take advantage of.
There's an interesting question in the Q&A about rot and insect infestation, which I think is kind of interesting. It's something that's, you see on typical balloon frame houses, for instance, but in a mass timber environment, is this still a concern? Michelle, John, I'm not sure who's best to answer.
Yeah, no, I can take this one. Yes, so rot and termites can be an issue for any timber, and the key for both of those items is to keep the timber dry. So the most important, much of the build of what we're talking about is an interior application, and as long as you've detailed your timber appropriately at the base, you have an appropriately detailed facade system, you'll be fine. You need to be much more careful when you're putting timber outside and really look closely at your detailing, making sure that you don't you don't have the, if the timber can get wet, that it's able to get dry. You don't have places where water can accumulate and cause rot. And there are treatments to the timber, but those of course add cost, and they won't give you, you know, a 100-year design life or anything. You really need to think about how you're keeping water away from your system.
I guess.
I was
Sorry,
going to
John.
add, I think it's a really important point. Michelle said it very well. I think one thing to add to it is the devil's in the details. You know, a lot of the things that we take for granted that are easy coordination items like balcony attachments, even if you don't have, you know, wood exposed on the exterior, that detail of even condensation and that propagating back into a wood connection can become a critical part of the project, you know, to really understand, you know, from a cost perspective, but also from a maintenance standpoint, and being able to actually visually inspect these critical components to the building.
Andrew, did you have any other follow-up on that?
It was a tangential follow-up, really, and that goes back to design considerations for Doug, I think, which is, you know, in your work, a lot of proposals that you've worked on for mass timber buildings, do you see it as a design expression more on the interior or on the exterior, or how do you see this as a design element potentially?
I'm not a big fan I'm a big fan of putting wood where it should belong, and I think that, you know, in terms of how you detail it, it's primarily a really great material when it's encapsulated in some other thing. You know, and that's just a personal preference. I think a lot of people are doing really innovative things with putting charred wood on the outside too, that has its own protection. But it seems sensible to me, like every material has its proper place and position, and maximize the value of each one of those. And what's interesting about the type 4 construction is most people view mass timber as type 4 construction, where you can see everything in wood. And has been mentioned a couple of different times, as you go vertical, it really doesn't look like a wood building, you know, because most of it's going to be encapsulated. It's still a good idea in terms of everything we talked about. But in the end, it's going to have gyp on the walls the same way, you know, any other construction has. But what's interesting to us is people actually kind of really like being in the type 4 HT world, because it gives them kind of the exact look that they want, even if it's only 85 feet tall.
There was another question more about the construction phase of using mass timber. And the question was, how do you manage the generation of timber waste during construction to maximize their use in other applications? And we were talking about prefabrication. So could somebody elaborate on that question?
I guess, no, Michelle, you go.
Well, I think there's maybe two different areas. So there's timber waste that's generated in the actual creation of timber panels, which again, I'm not kind of an expert in that field, but my understanding is that those industries are already quite good at finding alternative uses for their, you know, offcuts. So whether that's, you know, wood chips or sawdust, they have functions that some grades of wood chips can be made into various you know, non-structural OSB type material, plywood panels. So I think there's, within the industry, there is already, you know, a financial incentive to not have a lot of waste. And then beyond that, once you're actually, you know, you have your panels and you're trying to build a mass timber building, I think the fact that you do typically really plan out your projects in such a way that you've laid out all your panels, you've cut out all your openings, there's not a lot of waste, and there's almost no waste on site. So, and any waste is, again, in the factory that is dealt with in their kind of secondary stream that they do with their timber elements.
It's a very interesting question someone just posted on the structural side of beam support here, talking about strength properties of timber beams and potentially ideas of pre-stressing or other comparisons to a concrete structure. Anybody want to jump on that one?
That's a great question. I think those are some of the future hybrids that I think the whole industry is kind of honing in on where the opportunities are, especially when you're starting to get into other applications like labs or other types of facilities that have the desire to use mass timber. I think some of these hybrid systems like pre-stressing, but also composite systems and innovative ways to do composite integration with your topping slabs, which might be there for an acoustical reason more than a structural reason, or even a vibration reason. So there's some research even in Europe with notching and micro notching, just divots basically machined into the top of a CLT panel which is the inversion of a shear stud in basically in concept from a steel concrete interaction. So I think pre-stressing is another thing that's been discussed, particularly in seismic regions where you want hold downs on your lighter structure. There, you don't have the dead weight to resist the overturning as you typically do. These buildings are about half the weight of concrete. So yeah, I think that those types of discussions and research that the universities are going to start engaging on, I think quite a bit more, will really shape where timber buildings are going.
That was a great segue. Talking about strength properties per weight for this type of material. There was a question about cost comparison. Would we be able to kind of touch on the cost of these mass timber building materials as opposed to some other cheaper, more standard concrete steel building materials?
I can maybe just give a quick flavor on what we've seen recently. You know, we're doing it in many different markets, from the Midwest to the East Coast to the West Coast, where even cost of construction fluctuates wildly with labor rates and certain products. It is difficult to compete with most markets, particularly high efficient flat plate PT in the Midwest and even steel for that matter in the East Coast. But the market of timber fluctuates a lot. So as everyone probably knows right now, dimensional lumber costs are really skyrocketing currently, which everyone thinks will stabilize. But those are factors in the cost that are quite variable compared to most more traditional concrete and steel.
And Chris, do you mind talking about how maybe this material can be used to support the acoustic properties of the construction, and then you might save in other materials?
Yeah, I think it comes to the balancing of that buildup, and you can definitely, there's a lot of research that's been done recently, and I think as more of these projects come online, we'll see a lot more research acoustically on it. But finding which buildup's going to work right, and how we can be the most effective and the most cost effective in those buildups, I think there's a lot of opportunity out there.
Yeah, one thing I'd add to this discussion is that it's important to look at the building cost holistically as well. So you may have a project where you see the timber superstructure cost is, say, 10-15% higher, but potentially you have savings in your foundation because you have a lighter weight structure. You have savings in your finishes because you're exposing more of it if you're in a height range where you can expose a lot. So I think there are kind of larger, just looking at the bare structural cost may not paint the whole picture.
As a follow-up to that too, and going back to the very early discussion about the way it's harvested and life cycle costs for mass timber, in any of your completed projects so far, in any analysis, what are you guys seeing across the board in actual sustainability, actual savings from using this material?
From the initial impact on embodied carbon on the delivery, we're seeing greater impact when implementing mass timber. That does diminish when you start looking at the full life cycle analysis of the building. There's so many other aspects, from mechanical system and water usage and everything that goes into the operational side of a building over 50 to 100 years, where I think the actual structural frame in any type of material lasts quite long nowadays. So it's the initial impact on embodied carbon, I think, is where mass timber really changes the numbers.
I think also in terms of a lot of municipalities are being very aggressive in terms of what they're catching in their codes relative to sustainability and green buildings. And some of them are beginning to put in embodied energy into their codes. And once you start seeing that being a driver as opposed to just energy, in these building codes, you're going to start seeing people being pushed into systems that can help them actually build buildings and meet the codes that some of these municipalities that are a little more aggressive on the sustainability side are mandating.
So I was, kind of thinking through the recent code roadblocks are, what we talked about over the past 50 minutes about one of the biggest things getting into New York. And with the local law 94 about reducing emissions in New York City, have we seen the importance or the move to maybe timber solutions to support reducing embodied carbon for the total project?
I can speak to it a little bit, I suppose. I think you oftentimes have competing interests. The folks who are putting together the sustainability goals aren't the same people that are fighting the fires and aren't the same people that are inspecting the buildings. So the fire department has a very real concern with wood burns. The density of New York City is a real concern for the fire department as well, as fire can spread from one building to another, certainly with combustible materials. So I think you have different politics at play. And they don't always talk the same language. But,
I think in terms of a lot of the sustainability focus in the city has been around operational carbon, so much more on your services side than really looking as closely in embodied carbon. And I think that's where, once we're getting our operational carbon down, and the next place is embodied carbon, and it's becoming a much bigger impact for the overall building. So I'm not sure that it's the emphasis in a lot of the city policy right now, but I think it will be.
So I think that takes us just about to the end here, but there's a good closing question, I think, for everyone that we wanted to pose here, which is, fostering innovation in the industry. Again, coming back to the central goal here is, especially in New York, given the timeframes we've discussed with adoption of this material here, how important is it, do you think, to fostering innovation in the industry and the advancement of mass timber in New York, and how do you think this is going to affect our local industries in the long run? Doug, maybe kick it off and we can kind of pass that around a little bit, actually, because I think it affects everybody in slightly different ways depending on where your expertise lies and your experiences with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that infiltration relative to mass timber is probably going to start off in the the suburbs, some of the larger cities that are on the perimeter of New York City in terms of that, and that's where you're going to start seeing these things because they're New York State code or a different code than New York City itself. And then I imagine you're going to start seeing it in sort of the Brooklyn, Queens sort of zones, Staten Island, before it actually comes into Manhattan in a meaningful way, unless people start, like NYCHA, in terms of, unless an entity like that wants to start building, large volumes of affordable housing starts to pick it up as being a good thing. You might see infiltration coming in through these different sort of, arms of the government, so to speak. Our clients, the work that we do in New York City is too big at this point, so no one's really talking about it. I think there's interest in it, but I think you're going to start seeing the growth come from the perimeter and eventually kind of come into the center city. Also, you're going to see product being built in other cities that is captivating to our clients that work in a number of different cities. So you're going to see pressure from them, like, John's project. It's like, oh, that was a beautiful project. Why can't we do it here? All of a sudden, and you might see different ways and points of influence coming in that we wouldn't necessarily expect.
If I could add one thing, I think New York has really always been the heart of innovation for tall buildings. I think for the fact that maybe there's some hesitancy now, I think they have a great role to play in terms of trying to see where this is appropriate in that environment, in that building topology and urban density and tall. It would be a horrible missed opportunity not to continue the discussion out of an early dismissal. It doesn't have to look like it does in other parts of the country, but I think it'll be very, very interesting to watch the experts in New York, really from all aspects, from the fire department to the building industry, from the design and construction aspects, to really see how it makes sense in New York, because it should look different, depending on where you are.
I think also that the market is driven by the sort of innovator. Like if you have a developer coming in, building a unique product, and all of a sudden people are interested in it and it's leasing up well, and it's sort of, the envy, you'll find that that's usually how things sometimes sort of change the dial on New York City too. The first one out is a huge risk, but also has potentially a huge reward in terms of creating a whole new market.
Yeah, one market we haven't touched on that much yet, but I think is a big opportunity is higher education, and I think there's a lot of interest in higher education in mass timber from, there are many universities that are doing the research themselves and want to implement projects, but also projects like student housing are perfect for mass timber. Low rise kind of student housing projects, and also things like student centers and spaces in that scale. And so I think that's another kind of exciting area where we can also partner with the actual research institutions, which are the universities, to push the innovation, on these projects as well.
Yeah, and I'll just say again, from the code revision perspective, New York City has committed to adopting IBC for the long haul and updating it every 3 years or 3 to 6 years. Now that there is, new typologies in the 2021 IBC, and I think New York City is trying to be consistent with the IBC. I think that's the next gradual step, is if New York City adopts 2021 IBC and doesn't wholeheartedly revise the heavy timber section, I think that's the next opportunity for it to really move into New York City.
Chris, what are your thoughts as a closing here?
I think Doug had it right with the way it's going to start to come into New York City. We're already seeing projects out in Connecticut, and I think up in White Plains and a couple in Brooklyn area. And so I'm excited by that, because once something actually hits our market, the innovation for us, especially in my little niche of acoustics, is going to take off, and we're going to see a lot of research and a lot of exciting understanding of how these systems work and how we can optimize them.
Excellent. Well, I think that was the end to our program. I appreciate everybody for joining us, our panelists. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to everybody that came out today and supported the conversation. We had some great Q&A questions, and appreciate your time.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks again,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.